Okay, hello all. Welcome to this breakout session on the role and design of biodiversity offsets as a part of a just sustainability transition. Again, my name is Hanna Nikkanen and I will be moderating this session, which starts with a presentation from Dr. Atte Moilanen, Research Director at the University of Helsinki. And from Dr. Moilanen's presentation, we will learn about a scientifically competent design of biodiversity offsets looks like. And after the presentation, we will then move on to a panel discussion with experts and stakeholders. As you can see, there are quite many of them today on stage. So we'll have representatives from the key ministries, interest organizations, academia, and the business community who will be invited to discuss how to join forces to tackle biodiversity loss. And is there scientifically competent design acceptable for all stakeholders, and what, if anything, should be further considered when talking about biodiversity offsets? Again, we will focus on how to engage the private sector, and among other things, we'll touch upon the question of voluntary versus mandatory biodiversity offsetting. So that's what we have ahead of us for the next, what is it that we have? We have an hour and 45 minutes here before lunch. And now I'm honored to give the floor to Dr. Atte Moilanen. Please take the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. So my presentation today has basically three components in it. I'm going to be speaking fairly quickly because there's limited time. I'll be talking about the design of biodiversity offsets and what the questions are that you need to be answering when you do the design. And I'll have some comments about how these things are treated in the Finnish legislation that is planned and the instructions how to use the legislation. And then I'll have a few words about offset registers. So going forward, so if you are designing biodiversity offsets. So offsets are that you have ecological damage by a project and you want to compensate it by doing restoration or protection or habitat maintenance elsewhere. So if you are planning offsets, you have 17 decisions or factors that you need to account for. And these factors divide between the three axes of ecological reality. Those are space, time, and biodiversity. What do you have, where, and when? And then you have the human component, which is your objectives and the actions that you can do to do the actual ecological compensation for the losses that come from your actions. And I'm going to first go through these five axes and say a few words about the questions that there are for each. So the first one is objectives, and objectives to a certain degree determine how much and what kind of offsets do you need to be doing. And the first question there is adherence to the mitigation hierarchy, where you first avoid damage completely, then you minimize it, and then you go on to restoration and offsets. And that's a difficult part internationally and in Finland, because there are no clear rules about how much do you need to avoid and minimize before you can go on to restoration and offsets. Another component on this axis is how big offsets do you want to do? You can go for the iconic no net loss, NNL, which means that you fully compensate everything, the damage that you've done. But also presently, there's a push internationally that you go for what is called net positive impact, or NPI, where you actually do more. So say that you do 50% more, so you get 50% net positive impact. And then there's a third question, which is the interpretation of no net loss. And there's technical questions there about how do you incorporate uncertainty into your estimates. I'm not going to go into that. That's kind of technically involves business. The second axis where you have decisions is space. And the first one of these is the design area. How close can the offsets be to the ecological damage that has been caused? And usually it's said as close as possible, but that's very vague. And in Finland, the decision there is that we have in Finland approximately in the order of 10 what are called forest vegetation zones, and the rule would be that you need to do the offset in the same or neighboring forest vegetation zone. Another decision on the space axis is what I've been calling the frame of reference, and that refers to the fact that what is rare and what is common, what is red listed or not, depends on whether you are thinking locally, regionally, nationally, at the level of the European Union, or maybe globally. So you need to be specific about what legislation and what rules are you actually thinking about when you are doing the design for the offsets. Then you have factors that are associated with time. The first major one of these is permanence, or the duration of the offset. There you have the question like, is it allowed that you do the compensation by, let's say, temporary habitat maintenance, you maintain meadows or something for 10 or 20 years, or do the offsets have to be like once-off permanent actions, like that you protect some area? And I'll say something more about that in a later slide. Two other questions that are technical but still quite important on the time axis are evaluation time frame and time discounting. And what these mean is that you actually need to be specific about that in which time interval do you want your gains to compensate for your losses. It's a different thing if you allow 1,000 years for your compensation to mature compared to if you need to get the balance in 10 years. So it's a technical but still important decision, and in Finland, in the present legislation, the recommendation is going to be 30 years, so that on average over 30 years, the gains would be compensating for the losses. Also time discounting, you do a 1.5% yearly time discounting, and the meaning of that is that delayed gains are not as valuable as immediate gains. That's a simple thing from economics. Do you want to lend all your money to somebody for 100 years without any interest rate? It's not really credible. So devaluing delayed gains is important. The third axis where you have questions to account for is biodiversity. This relates to the reference frame and legislation, and you need to think about that what factors do you want to be measuring. And in Finland, at present, the preference would probably be, in most cases, you are interested about structural habitat features that are determining how natural habitats are. So let's say, for example, dead wood in forests, which are substrate for a large fraction of the forest-dwelling species. That would be that kind of a factor. And the reason why we talk about that more is that there's about 8.7 million species in the world, and it's really hard if you need to be planning offsets individually per species. Then there's a question about what is called trading up. So this relates to that, how similar does the offset need to be to the losses? And trading up is the question that, can you change one type of a habitat for something that is different but somehow better from the perspective of conservation? And that would be, replacing one type of a forest with something which is like, say, a herb-rich forest, which is valuable for biodiversity. The third question is that, are there limits to what biodiversity can be offset? And in Finland, there's been a report by the Finnish Environment Institute where they've been classifying Finnish habitats to those that can be offset easily, those that can be offset by difficulty, and those that we don't really know how to offset right now. And it may be that damage and offsets will not be allowed for those habitats that are like red in this scale, that you just don't know how to replace them. It could be like a serpentine rock or something which you just cannot regenerate. The final axis of offset design is the actions that you'll be doing. So, okay, you get losses, you build a road, or you build a mine, or you build a new residential area, you lose some habitat, and that's where you get your losses. But the actions then are the things that generate you the ecological gains elsewhere: habitat restoration, protection, maintenance. And there's 6 questions here that need to be accounted for. The first is additionality. Are the actions new? So, for example, it's not allowed that an area that has been protected previously is named as an offset, because there's nothing new. Your new action doesn't give, there's no additional value. Then there's what is called avoided loss response, and that comes from the mechanism of habitat protection. When you protect an area, you reduce or remove the human pressures from that area, and that is called avoided loss. By reducing the pressures, you reduce the losses expected in that area in the future. And there's a response for that. Similarly, if you do habitat restoration, you expect a response where the habitat starts improving to a more natural direction, and that takes time, and there you have a response through time. Leakage is something which is directly associated with avoided loss or protection offsets. A concrete example is if you protect forest, there's a high usage pressure on forests in Finland. So you can protect a bit of forest, but the wood extraction pressure will move elsewhere and cause ecological damage elsewhere. So you need to reduce the gains that you calculate from protecting a particular bit of forest. The final thing here is monitoring and adaptive implementation of offsets. Now, here's just an example. I'm showing you how, what kind of, how in the estimation of gain, the actions and time work together. So the green area could be the condition of a forest which is protected at time 0. And so when you protect it, part of the pressures leak elsewhere, more wood is collected from elsewhere, you lose those gains, this is how much you have remaining. Then you account for the thing that the forest is not there only because of your offset. It was there before, and it would have been there at least for some time later as well. So you need to account for the rate at which the gains accumulate. Then you apply time discounting to those gains, you get something like this. Then you cut to your 30-year evaluation interval, and then you have a mean additional leakage corrected time discounted gain, which is rather less. So the realistic gain is much less than the apparent if you just look at what is there. All of that is not there because of what you did. Now, going forward, I have a few slides about complications in offsets and stuff. Offsets are not particularly easy. They are relatively complicated, as I showed you, 17 factors or decisions. You need a fairly high competence in their design and implementation, although of course you can standardize things so that you don't need to invent everything again for every case. There's a high number of species and habitats which have, for example, your actions have habitat-specific consequences, and you don't know those consequences for most habitats or species. And there's unavoidable subjective decisions. It's just a fact. I mean, what time interval are you using? What time discounting? So on. There's easy ways to fail offsets. I'm just going to say a few things about those. So one is a single species offset, that you only offset one species out of the entire ecology, and that's a special case of limited application scope. Lack of permanence is pretty much a fail, because if you have permanent losses but you have temporary gains, over the long run, nature will always lose. That said, many countries do have temporary offsets. If you allow double counting, you know that an area that has been protected before can be named as an offset. That's a fail. If you ignore leakage in avoided loss offsets, like with the forests, that's a direct fail. And you could also confuse gross amount with net gain. I've seen examples of this, and that would be the thing on the, on the right over here. It's not the total amount of biodiversity in an area which is due to the offset, but there's a certain net gain only that you can count. And if you don't monitor implementation, and if you have no sanctions for failure, This has occurred in some countries. Nobody checks that the offsets were implemented. Nobody monitors them. There's no sanctions, if they weren't done. This is a topic that I wanted to add, and it's related to the single species offsets. And I think it's very important that the ecology is also the common species. It's not only the red-listed species and habitats. And that's fundamentally because you have things like regional spatial population dynamics and food webs. The rare species that you have in certain areas, they are supported by the common biodiversity in that area and in the neighborhood. So if you lose a lot of common stuff, the endangered stuff will suffer as well. Also, if you ignore common things and every 10 years you evaluate what the population trends are, in something like 20 or 30 years you may realize that some of your common things have become rare. So it's not okay to only offset the red-listed things and ignore the common things, in my opinion. So just going to offset registers is something that's going to be implemented in Finland if the offsets go ahead. So they are still in the process of being, the legislation has to be accepted in the parliament. Heini Kujala this year did a study where they published that they found 66 countries that had an offset register. 66 countries with offset legislation or offsets in use. 9 of them had an offset register. It was public only in 4 countries. So it's not really surprising that people are suspicious about offsets if the details of what was lost and gained are not made public. You can't really evaluate them post hoc. So in Finland, there's going to be a public transparent register that supports the administration, but also facilitates development and learning. You learn about the effects of the actions and you improve your designs iteratively over many years. Things you want to include there was that, what was compensated, where, when and how, some details of the design and implementation process. You want to observe the implementation, and there might be also compensation areas that people are or businesses are offering as offsets there. But that will not be exclusive. Some stakeholders will be having their own marketplaces where they are offering areas for offsets. I'm going to be concluding with a slide where there's a schematic of how this stuff works together. And this is going to be left up here behind the panel. So going through this very quickly, an offset, you want to have your gains bigger than the no net loss or net positive impact requirement that you have. The requirement pretty much comes from your objectives. Now, the gains that you are getting, they are limited by the spatial area where you are allowed to be doing the offsets. Losses are measured. You have direct losses under a footprint and you have indirect losses in the neighborhood. Gains are always estimated. You have the reference frame, and that is inputting into the biodiversity measurement, trading up and limits. What you care for, what you think is trading up, and what are things that you can't do. And the gains component here is a combination of the actions that you do and the time axis. Those together, in some kind of a process, generate your estimation of gains. You cannot measure your gains because the gains happen in the future. You have to estimate or predict them. What you lose is known because you can measure it from the ground. And with that said, thank you, and we'll leave the rest to the panel.
And
maybe questions.
And because there's a few minutes time for a couple of questions, so that's why I wanted to ask Dr. Moilanen to stay here. So from the audience, what do you have to ask at this point before we invite the rest of the panelists? We have a mic there, so.
Thank you. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I'm Rosa Lampela from Kauppalehti. I would like to ask how widely these are used by, for example, Finnish business, and then from the side of climate offset, we know that it is advisable to reduce always emissions instead of offsetting. So how effective it is doing this kind of work?
Okay, so offsets are kind of new in Finland. The first large offset projects are maybe ongoing, so there wouldn't be many cases that go beyond a single species offset. And the other question was, say again.
How does the offsetting compare to just
reduction?
Yeah. So the thing is that usually it's much easier to avoid the losses than to do the compensation. Then if you do have a case where you just cannot avoid the losses, then you would go for the offsets. But in general, it would be cheaper and easier to just not do the damage. Yeah.
More questions?
Thank you very much. I'm Leif Schulman from the Finnish Environment Institute. I think it's maybe not a question, rather a comment, but I think it's extremely important that you emphasize not emphasizing the rare and endangered, red-listed elements of nature. I think both in our country and in many other countries, most other countries maybe, the emphasis is wrongly placed on those. Do you think we have any chance of reversing that?
I don't know really. I mean, it seems like if you have an environmental impact assessment, then if you only have common biodiversity there, then in principle you don't need to be doing anything. So it would require kind of a rather large change in the society that you would actually start actively also avoiding damage to common things. But maybe in the avoidance and minimization part, it's realistic to actually be avoiding all kinds of damage, including for the more common biodiversity. So this is more for the policy people, really. But thank you for supporting that point. I think it's quite important. I think it's one underlying reason why we are having a continued decline of the rare species in the world.
And I have one question here now. And you said earlier that you understand why there is a lot of criticism of offsets and a lot of distrust. And some people would say that this is bound to be an unsatisfactory tool. What do you say to that? Why is it important that we still strive for a scientifically sound definition of offsets?
Well, the reasons why offsets have failed globally is that, first of all, there's been botched design where the compensation areas have been just too small and you've been having temporary offsets. So there's multiple design reasons why offsets have failed. Well, we don't need to be replicating those design failures in Finland. I think we have a pretty good understanding of how not to do that. And also there's been these cases, I won't name the countries, but where businesses say that they will do an offset, then they don't do it. Nobody checks it out, and there's no penalties. I mean, that's an administrative failure. Who says that you need to allow that kind of a thing? So I reckon that if you are going for net positive impact offsets and you do the design properly and all that stuff, at least for individual projects, you can end up with a result which is much better than what you would be having without the offsets. But of course, the global biodiversity is under enormous pressure, so it's like that offsets alone are hardly going to be reversing the trends.
Thank you. And now I'm inviting, so please take a seat. I'll keep this to myself. And now I'm inviting all of our panelists. You're free to choose a chair. And welcome, and thank you for being here. Okay, I'll move here. Now it's time for introductions. I'm going to ask all of you what your role in biodiversity offsetting is, or what your relationship to the issue, to the topic of the panel today is. And we'll start right here at my left. Markku Mäki-Hakola, you're the forest director at MTK, the Central Union of Agricultural Producers and Forest Owners. Welcome.
Thank you, that's true. Nice to be here. What's my role? I could say I have multiple roles. Of course, we represent forest owners. Almost all forest owners are members in my organization, and they are that people who are prepared and who have the possibility to provide ecological compensation. We are in MTK, my organization. We are also developing new tools for forest owners. For example, we launched last July the first version of naturevalues.fi. It's a marketplace. Hopefully, it will be a marketplace for ecological compensation also in the future. So, quite many ways how I'm involved.
Thank you. And next up, we have Janne you're the leading expert or chief policy advisor at the Confederation of Finnish Industries, so EEAC in Finland. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, and happy to be here. My role in terms of biodiversity is to try to help companies and trade associations to find ways to actually tackle biodiversity loss and incorporate going net positive in their own operations. In terms of how far we've already come, we can come back to that later, but I think it's fair to say that companies have just waken up to the issue of biodiversity loss, and now they're going full speed into finding ways to understand better what their impacts are and how to then mitigate them, and then comes offsets as well. But we are in the very first baby steps in terms of understanding the magnitude of the issue and how that will impact companies and how companies can actually take action to reduce their impact and go into positive. And that's basically, we are at least 5 or even 10, 15 years behind what's happening in terms of climate. So we need to fast track in this regard.
Thank you. And next up we have Ilona Lundström, who's head and chief director of Innovations and Business Financing Department at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I'm Director General in charge of innovation policy, enterprise financing and industrial policy at the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and my role is threefold: in enhancing innovation and of course also financing research to seek for new technologies, new knowledge, new solutions into this theme. On the other hand, we are also enhancing green financing as a whole in Finland, and we have a lot of work in that field ongoing. And the third role, of course, is doing legislation and implementing this into current legislation.
And then we have 2 panelists / commentators. Professor Emeritus Markku Ollikainen, who's the chair of the Finnish Climate Change Panel, and we have Janne Kotiaho, chair of the Finnish Nature Panel, both professors.
Okay, I've been dealing with ecological compensation as an economist in my research, meaning that I've been analyzing how we could develop a compensation market based on these ecological approaches that Atte just presented to us, so that we would have a set of prices that will guide the choices by the companies when they make their investment decisions, when they make their practical choices, so that the price of spoiling the environment would be a principle in market, and that could guide the choices, but the companies do.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I think that I have kind of 2 roles. My role as an academic, I'm a professor and researcher, is to kind of develop the tools and thinking of how to avoid the failures that Atte was talking about when we are actually dealing with biodiversity offsetting. And as an academic, I'm a colleague of Atte and supporting Atte in the work that he was just showing. Then, on the other hand, as a chair of the panel, I'm kind of working at the interface of science and policy. And here, I think that my role is to help the government to adopt the biodiversity offsetting in a way that it will be really competently done. And also the legislation, of course, this is going to be part of the Nature Protection Act in the new legislation, so we have been supporting that as well.
Exactly. And then we have one extra panelist who is Juhani Damski who's the Permanent State Secretary at the Ministry of the Environment. He could not join us live today, so he will be joining us remotely at one point in this panel. But we figured that it's still the simplest to have us who are here physically present having a conversation now here, and then we'll invite Juhani Damski to join us a bit later. But now, so from Dr. Moilanen's presentation, we learned what kinds of key principles there are that impact, what would a scientifically competent design of biodiversity offsets look like, and what all kinds of different aspects need to be taken into account, and what uncertainties there are. And the first question here that I have for the entire panel is that, do these principles, is it possible, like within all of these, within this framework, to have enough of an incentive for the private sector and landowners to participate? Can you name, are there like critical questions that might be a challenge, that might be difficult to address when biodiversity offsetting is like further adopted into practice? And now you're, you're free to answer.
We have lots of experience from voluntary systems. Not only concerning ecological compensations, we have experience from nutrient load trading systems in the United States and other countries, and this evidence is quite obvious. If everything is based on, relies on voluntary basis, this will not work. Usually it's only the pioneering or the most responsible companies that will take the compensations, and they are always under the risk of reputation, because somebody may say that this is greenwashing if there are no clear rules. But if we have mandatory, so the state requires every company to make compensations if they change ecosystems, then the companies need to demand for restoration projects, and that gives then landowners the possibility to bear the costs that are needed to restore the lands and supply them to the market. So this would raise up compensation as a mainstream thing.
And that's actually a topic that we will then like have more time to cover, the mandatory versus voluntary offsets question. But Markku Mäki-Hakala, you had a comment to this.
Yes, it was a nice presentation from Atte, and it shows the complexity what we have. There are things which are easier. There are things which are more difficult. I'm looking at this from the forest owner's perspective, and the additionality, for example, how much we need that, what's the place, how far away from the forest you may do the compensation, and so on. There are tools, but I think that we are not able to answer to your question yet. And I'm a little bit sad that we fully support the compensation in MTK, but I'm a little bit sad that we are already taking this to the legislation. We have, this gentleman knows it better, we have great process going on, we have great investigation going on, what kind of model we should have in Finland. We have piloting going on. And on the governmental program, it was written that we do the piloting first and then legislation. Now we're doing the legislation instead of okay, at the same time piloting. But I think that there are so many open questions that we need to decide what kind of model we are going to do. And it's a little bit strange also that we continue about the voluntary and mandatory compensation later, but it's a little bit strange that we start from the voluntary compensation, which could be marketplace based. Old days, perhaps, there was not so much understanding that we need this kind of offsetting compensation models. But nowadays, I think that every company in Finland knows that we need to do more for the nature. And there is room for this.
Ilona, Lundström, maybe you want to comment on the legislation versus piloting first.
Thank you. I'm a true believer in smart legislation, and it has its role also in kind of pushing forward the future we need. But legislation is a very, very, very simple tool, and we are now talking about extremely complex issue that we need to put in legislation, and that is not an easy job. And we need more answers also from the research society as a whole, a research community, how to do that in practice. Since I have to be very sincere, if we look at, for example, Mining Act in Finland, I have 3 experts writing that law in Finland as a whole. So they cannot be experts in every single field that they have to take into account when renewing the legislation. And there we need all the expertise that is in the field to make these solutions into a piece of legislation. And having said that, I think we have to talk about the global scale at the same time, since these issues are global, the companies are global, businesses are global, so the solutions also need to be global. We, of course, acknowledge that we need to take steps on national scale, but that is not enough if we are talking about the leakage problem. It is huge on global scale, and if we are saying that not in our backyard, it's happening somewhere else in the world, and these issues has to be tackled in a global scale. We need also some kind of global legislation, I think.
Janne, you had a comment.
Yeah. In terms of the voluntary versus mandatory or legislative measures, let's look at traffic, for example. If we have speed limits, if those were voluntary, I would make the assumption that most people wouldn't follow them despite their good kind of intentions. People just tend to be lazy or selfish, and that's how it goes. And that same applies to markets as general as well. But the thing and the difficulty in terms of biodiversity offsetting, for example, is that we don't really yet fully know how to measure the speed of the vehicle. So it's very difficult to have a kind of robust speed limit legislation if you don't fully know how to measure the speed. And that's I think, the character of the issue we are currently having at hand. But when we look at the activities that our companies and trade associations in Finland have taken, many of them already have charted their pathways towards reaching no net loss and going towards or beyond that to net positive impacts. And what they are calling for is the robust frame on how to actually utilize offsets as part of their work. So they're fully committed to do that, but they want to do it right. And I 99.5% agree with what Atte said previously, but this is way too complicated for us to utilize in terms of kind of making the demand that all of our companies would have one person in charge of making offsets robust. So we need to have the marketplace to develop into that way, and at the end it will boil down to legislation. But acknowledging that we are not fully there yet, we need to find ways to fast-track the development already before going into the legislation. That's where piloting is important. Then I understand that in Finland we have this Metso program where voluntary activities have been supported by government funding. So those kind of activities could help us fast-track this development, because at the end we will need the legislation. It will need to be both in Finland and within the European Union and globally as well. But when we go into the legislation track, it needs to be robust.
But how about then if we're talking about a compensation marketplace that also Atte was talking about, having an official register for ecological compensation that would then ensure that certain criteria are fulfilled. Do you see that would be, and I guess this question I have is especially to you, Janne and Markku, this criteria would then be defined by the Finnish Nature Conservation Act. Is that step towards that direction? Is that a good opportunity, or are there potential challenges to that?
That's exactly the step we are currently missing. That's what we need. We need to have a public and open and transparent register where you have these projects that have been measured against a robust criteria, and so that every company who wants to engage in offsetting can then go into and purchase credits that are true. So we don't want to go into the kind of fuss we've had with the first generation climate credits, that half of them were pretty much hot air. We don't want to repeat those mistakes here. So the first thing we need to have is a transparent and robust register where you can actually trust that what you buy has actually had a true impact.
Markku.
I think that we need to talk about two different things. The first is this compensation register, transparent, and so that's definitely something what we need. But then if we are building markets, my opinion is that if we want to have a fully working compensation market, it needs to be pulled between market players, not by government. It's the same thing. The Ministry of Health, it's not building Tinder. The Ministry of Forestry is not building a wood marketplace. The Ministry of Transport, they are not building a marketplace for use motor vehicles. And this is exactly the same thing. We need the marketplaces between market players where to buy and sell the compensation, the offsetting. But we need it to be linked to this compensation register so that everybody knows what we are doing. So two different things. Please do not build a marketplace by government, but please do build this register, transparent and open.
Markku, do you have comments to that?
If I take a comparison to EU ETS, emissions trading, the government or the EU didn't try to develop any marketplace because it was created by the market. But what the government did, or the EU did, was it put a cap on emissions. And that cap was the thing that created then the trading, buyers and sellers, and this activity created then the marketplaces like EEAC and such. And in our case, timing is of course one thing that we need to think when we know enough, but it's enough for the government to require that ecological compensations must be made if you are kind of destroying habitat. And then this creates the demand. And then it's the market players then will find out what are the marketplaces. They will create, I'm sure there will be intermediary companies, those who have the expertise, who can do the calculations relating to the biodiversity values based on the criteria that Atte just showed to us. Those have the possibility then to keep up prices or show up prices, which also the register should have. Absolutely, it should have prices, because we want to have the prices to guide the investment decisions that the companies make. So that will be created, and I agree with Markku that that's not a government job. But government job is to create the legislation. The thing is only when we do it. But currently, actually, we don't have. What we have on ecological compensation in this Nature Reservation Act is just as a kind of exception when we allow some harm to be done to the, let's say, to conservative areas. So that's not actual the idea of compensations at all.
Janne Kotiaho, you had a comment.
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. So this thing that we are taking it to the legislation right now, I think that this is very important that it's the time that we are doing it right now. What we are actually taking into the legislation is the rules of the game. And that's what we need, because the failures that Atte was showing are due to the fact that we don't have rules around the globe. So that's why we need to take them right now to the legislation, and they are there, which is really good. About the piloting phase, the piloting is not about the principles. We don't need to pilot the principles because we know the principles from the scientific research that we have completed. So the principles are there. They are not negotiable. They are, if you don't fulfill the principles, it's fail, like Atte was showing. So what needs to be perhaps piloted then is how do we adopt these things into the practice? So the practical work may need some piloting, but the principles don't need really piloting, and that's good that it's now going to be in the legislation as it is. And of course, the government is not building a marketplace, it's building the register and then hoping that all of the marketplaces will actually, through some service, put their offsets to the register and then sell them on their own various platforms that they will be forming.
I have two questions now. One of them is about principles, and the other one is then about putting them into practice. The criteria would include permanence of the offsets, and that will mean then, for example, that the site that is used to produce the offsets should be protected to make sure that they will remain protected for a longer time frame than otherwise could be guaranteed. Is that fine, for example, with landowners, with businesses? Markku, I'm looking at you.
I had to. Of course, it's all right if it's marketplace-based. Yeah. Markku told that this may provide possibilities for forest owners, for example, and that's true. Through compensatory markets, the forest owner may have other possibilities than selling roundwood or Metso program or something like that. And it may provide possibilities. If forest owner wants to build a permanent conservation area through compensation mechanism, that's, of course, it's all right. It's about price and negotiations, what kind of things we are doing. So, yeah.
And then another, or did you have Janne, go ahead.
Just very briefly, in terms of from business perspective, the users of these offsets, I think it's mandatory. Kind of, if you have offsets in the marketplace that are kind of semi-offsets, like for the first 10 years, 15 years, and so forth, it boils down with the kind of the failures that Atte already pointed out, that you make a permanent reduction in biodiversity, but then you offset it with semi-permanent. So it doesn't add up. So it has to be true and honest, and in that regard, it has to be permanent.
Then my second question is about price transparency. So offsets are being sold and bought on marketplaces in the future. Price transparency of these transactions, what's your view on that? Markku?
That's one reason why we are building this naturevalues.fi, luontoarvot.fi marketplace. We need to have a marketplace for nature values. We don't have that kind of mechanisms yet. And if I compare it to, for example, a roundwood market, we wouldn't have any roundwood market without price information, without the amount information. And the same thing is with nature values. If we want to have an open market, then we need also the price information. So we need that. Yeah.
If I continue, I think that's crucial. I think in a broader sense, offsets serve at least two kind of roles in the market. The first one is, of course, actually offsetting the damage done to nature, but the other one is providing a price for the damage. And then if you don't have that price information fully and transparently available, then it's not going to affect and impact the investment decisions that other players in the market are doing. So in that regard, if we go into some kind of an over-the-counter kind of secret priced offset trading, it will not serve one of the vital purposes of producing a price information signal to the market.
Did you have a comment?
If I may.
Okay, yeah, Markku, go ahead.
Just imagine about the companies that are doing investment. If they know the prices, the first thing is that they think that where do I locate this investment? If this is, let's say, a rural biotope, which will be very expensive. So I wouldn't take that because it's rare and it's expensive. So I find out a place where the price of the offset is low. Then I think the next thing, when I make this investment, how large land area I will kind of develop. So could I use or could I make the buildings or things, whatever I'm doing, in a less land area? And then the third thing is that how do I build? How do I work? can I also kind of reduce those impacts? This is how the prices work for companies. And that may lead to some, when it comes to construction or infrastructure, that may even lead to some new innovations. And the other thing, if I look at from the point of view of landowners, restoration is also something that we don't know that much yet, even though the Forest Service has done it some time. But the forest landowners thought they need the price to think that how do I do this restoration, and then what is the best way of doing it so that I get lots of credits out of this for the given price. That also is one source of innovations then in the restoration business. So I think that it's very, very important that it's transparent. And it's awful that we have now the decision that the register does not have the prices. I can't understand why that has been chosen as the approach, given that this is the whole thing. You just compare this to the carbon price. For instance, the price of the EU emission allowance price that guides nowadays innovations, research and development, and actual production.
And judging from here, there's also no opposition, at least based on this panel that we can find. Now, I had comments asked for by Ilona Lundström and Markku Mäki-Hakola. And then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yes, a small comment regarding the mitigation hierarchy that you just excellently explained. It is part of current planning already in this kind of project, and it is a part of current legislation as well. So we do have this kind of thinking, but we don't have the pricing. From my point of view, one part of developing legislation, one very important part is that it is technology neutral, so that the legislation that we need doesn't kind of rule out any future solutions that could help us in tackling the issue, and at the same time we give the actual freedom for innovation at the same time. And third component is that when I look at the financial markets today, I think green financing is also going to steer towards this kind of solutions very fast. So there's pressure coming from other sides of the society at the same time, and this is only good thing. If we look at the investments made that are going to be made in the future, I think also how to get financing for those investments is very much up to the fact that how can you plan, how can you mitigate, how can you avoid the loss in, for example, biodiversity at the same time. It comes from the private sector as well.
Yes, I had a little bit same comment that Ilona about this, for example, this sustainable financing, that we are going into that direction, that the market will build a place for nature values. What government and authorities should do is to make the ground for the markets. We have been trying to build, for example, trying to build a nature values trading for forest owners quite a long time ago already. It was the time when we were piloting a Metso program. There were good ideas to build this kind of nature values trading system, but because of legislation, it wasn't possible to build that kind of system, which is openly marketing and open pricing and so on. Now we have the possibility to do that. And I would say, please trust the market on here. All indicators are leading that way, that markets are ready to build some kind of place for nature values. This permanency, how permanent these areas, for example, should be, it's a difficult question. The climate is changing and nature is constantly changing. It may be forest fires and so. What about that? It should be permanent, of course, but we can't influence everything what's happening. So I would do this piloting, this criterion combined with the real life, and then do the legislation. Not yet. Of course, we have good information what kind of criteria there should be behind compensation, but are they really applicable at the real life? Then please do not rush. This is a good thing.
I can see that Janne Kotiaho might have comments to this, but I do want to move us on to our next theme. There will be time for more comments later. But talking about the objectives, which is what Atte Moilanen started his presentation with. We heard about the concepts of no net loss and net positive impact to clarify those concepts. So no net loss means that the overall damage that is caused for nature is no greater than the improvements accomplished with ecosystem restoration and protection. And then, of course, here we also have questions about unexpected consequences, forest fires, so on, which makes it difficult to anyways have an exact to make an exact prognosis of what is going to happen in a certain area. But net positive impact then means that the improvements that we accomplish are greater than the damage that we cause. Now, in global biodiversity frameworks, developed by the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and as well as in the EU the Biodiversity Strategy, we see that the commonly agreed targets are moving from no net loss towards net positive impact. That has been happening for some time now. So in biodiversity offsetting, and this is a question to all panelists, what is the ambition level that you consider feasible and enough at this point, and why? Are we all looking at net positive impact, or do you have? Do you want to add something to that?
Well, yeah. Kind of when looking at the roadmaps that some of our industries already have done, they tend to find out that's the only solution in the long term to go net positive impact. Mm-hmm. So no net loss is only halfway, and then going beyond that is the end goal. I would like to look at the science guys here, kind of about the feasibility, if that's truly possible in a sense, and whether that's even enough, and how fast that should happen. Because when looking at the different roadmaps, the net positive impacts, they are gained maybe in 2040s, 2050s, and looking at the global data in terms of the kind of speed of loss of biodiversity, I don't see how that matches up. So that's definitely an issue, but I'm not sure if our infrastructure and knowledge and kind of the potential to go beyond no net loss is already in such a good shape that we could say that for example industry X goes net positive by 2025. I just don't see that quite realistic as of now.
And that's actually a very good point. I'll hang on to that. But Markku Mäki-Hakola, you had a comment here.
Yes, you had a very difficult question.
Sorry, it was a very long one.
Yeah, but I think this net positivity, it's described very well what forest owners are doing on their daily life. How many of you are forest owners? Here? So I suppose you are multi-objective forest owners. You at the same time you are producing roundwood. Perhaps you are producing nature values, energy, recreation values, and so on. And those are exactly the same things what society wants. If we ask from government what they want to have from our forest, they exactly the same things what forest owners are providing, and they combine the same things at all forests actually. So that some kind of net positive on larger scale, and that's one of our problems, that we are not looking at the larger scale. We are mostly talking about biodiversity. At the same time, we need to talk also about economy, climate, and so on. And perhaps we should discuss more about the, I don't know the English term, the general optimal. Instead of course, we need to have these net positive impacts. But is it the same thing that the general optimal? If we want to have at the same time forest to providing all these benefits, if we need to choose in this forest, for example, we want to maximize biodiversity, but we are losing growth, for example, and that may lead that we are supporting fossil society instead of biocircular society. Then if forest owner, for example, or business is not able to act profitability, then they don't have the capacity to invest to greener technology, to fossil-free value chains and so on. So perhaps we should discuss more about which is the optimal solution. Perhaps it's the same than net positivity. I don't know. If you know, please tell.
Okay, Ilona, Lundström.
Now, unfortunately, in this theme, I have no final answers. I have only some opinions and maybe good guesses, but nothing further than that. Of course, if I look at the R&D and I financing point of view, almost everything we finance by government is reaching towards net positive impact as a whole. So it's a policy that has been implemented for a very long time. It's a governmental target that, for example, our export industry as a whole could help out to build a handprint in the world, not only be able to measure the footprint, but actually build a handprint to provide solutions. But then at the same time, when I look at the current global situation, we have a war in Europe. Everything is about geopolitics. And if I look at, for example, at the need for minerals to tackle climate change, and if we want to have the future of, for example, e-mobility as a whole, the need for minerals is huge. And when we look at, I think the discussion previously was excellent, but if we look at where the mines are located, how much we need of them for the future we are striving for, I think there's a lot of talks we need to have still to balance out the futures and how to make it sustainable for the whole world. The whole Belt and Road Initiative from China is about geopolitics, it's about minerals, it's about gaining the materials of the future. And I think that has to be also taken into account. We are talking very much in Europe about strategic autonomy at this point, and in Finland about for example, reserving our own needs for emergency supply. So these kind of policy issues have to be taken into account as well.
Markku, Ollikainen.
I leave Janne the last word. But let's say two different dimensions. But let me come first to biodiversity. So ecological compensations are one tool among the whole set of biodiversity conservation decisions. Very much depends on what is the level of strict preservation, what is the state of voluntary metso type of solution, and many others. So the question, and then the question whether no net loss versus net benefit, net positive impact is also quantitative. So is it just like slightly above no net loss, or what does it mean? So we need to look at everything when it comes to biodiversity as a whole. But if you take, let's say, the safety margin approach, of course it would be more than no net loss, just given all the uncertainties that we have. When it comes to the broader issues, that then relates how much we should allocate resources to biodiversity conservation versus others. I would be quite cautious of saying that biodiversity conservation would destroy our possibilities. Biodiversity conservation requires lots of innovations. It provides lots of benefits that benefit our industries otherwise, and that increases our competitiveness. So when it comes to fossil fuels, there is no kind of choice between biodiversity or reduction of fossil fuels. We have the technologies, and they are coming from other sources than wood. They are coming from energy solutions, new hydrogen solutions, and those will help us out of fossil fossil economy. And the same thing comes to the materials. Actually, if we shift, the green transition means that we reduce the use of natural resources, non-renewable natural resources, to 1/5 of the current one. This was, you may check out Hang et al. 2020. But I agree that, okay, there may be some critical materials, critical minerals that we should take into account. But placing biodiversity in this whole picture does not give any reason to reduce our efforts to biodiversity conservation.
Okay, so I'm just like to wrap up a few things that have been said before I give the floor to Janne Kotiaho. The question was whether net positive impact is a feasible goal. And in fact, something that Janne Peljo said is very important for me as a journalist, because I need to be also evaluating these. For example, if a company makes a pledge to be net positive impact by 2025, do we have the tools? Do we have the knowledge to evaluate that promise, that pledge? What are those tools? What is needed for that kind of a pledge to be concrete and real and transparent? And then, so that is a feasibility question. And then, of course, is there a risk that the ambitious biodiversity goals would then step on the toes of some other goal, critical materials, energy transition, so on? So Janne Kotiaho, to wrap up this part of our conversation, what are your views on this question of feasibility of NPI?
So this comes to the question of scale. So at the project scale, it is already doable. It has been done in Finland, or the calculations have been done in Finland, and partly also the offsetting has already been done in Finland in a large scale in one project. So at the project level, it is definitely feasible. But then we touched upon the mandatory and voluntary issue. And the question is that, can this ever be enough if it's not mandatory for every single project that damages the nature? And my answer to that is that no, it will not be. Because voluntarily, everybody is not going to offset everything that they cause. Okay, then we can actually come back to the global issue as well, that this is now, we are talking about within Finland legislation. But of course, we can show to the world that look, this is how this should be dealt with, and if you follow these principles, then you can succeed at the project level. And then, of course, it needs to be scaled up to the nation level. And even if we meet this kind of net positive impact at a project level, it is quite far that we will meet it at the national level. And there, I think that we need to have the mandatory aspect of this thing. But maybe, like, if we are serious about stopping biodiversity loss, like we have been saying this convention after convention after convention, and now is maybe the third or fourth time when we say that, okay, from 10 years on, we have stopped the biodiversity loss. Yes, now we are really going to do it. So biodiversity offsetting, like Markku was saying here, it's one tool to actually help to reach that goal, but it is one tool that we must have because we are not stopping development. We are not stopping development, and therefore there is no other option but take up mandatory biodiversity offsetting. Otherwise, we are not going to stop biodiversity loss.
And that is actually the next theme that we're going to discuss, is the voluntary versus mandatory offsetting. And this is where I'd like to invite Juhani Damski, who is Permanent State Secretary from the Ministry of the Environment. He's going to join us here on the screen. Do we have Juhani Damski online? Perfect. This is now our first question about this is which one does the Ministry of the Environment want to promote and why? Why? Mandatory or voluntary biodiversity offsetting?
Thank you. I guess you hear me?
We need just a moment. We're just turning up the volume so that everyone can hear you.
Very good. And perhaps you can even see me.
We are about to see you. I can see you on a tiny screen. We just like, okay.
Are we ready? No?
Okay. Yes, go ahead. So mandatory and voluntary biodiversity offsetting. Which one does the Ministry of the Environment want to promote and why?
Thank you. Thank you very much for, first of all, having me here. I'm Juhani, and as was said, from the Ministry of Environment. I was able to follow some of the discussions already, and I'm very sorry and sad that I couldn't join you with all your panelists and all the experts that you have there present right now. Unfortunately, I had a corona, so I needed to separate me with the others, so that's the reason why I'm here. I think that the essential question, I think that you probably have already discussed this, is the in the ecological offsetting is whether it's voluntary or obligatory, is how to ensure that the losses are offset to full extent. And I think that this was just discussed in the previous section. And as was already also, I heard that was already stated that in Finland we have now a new Nature Conservation Act, and that has been recently submitted to the Parliament. And this proposal is based on the concept of voluntary offsetting. And but then again, in this new act, ecological offsetting has been addressed by the inclusion of strict requirements in the act itself. And this means that these requirements must be taken in relation to time, space, and ecological equivalence. And you can perhaps say that we aim to create a standard now here in Finland, based on good practices and especially based on the solid science. So I don't go into details of these requirements, but I would like to point out really and underline perhaps that offset activities do not allow easier derogations from the new Nature Conservation Act. This is one part of it. So voluntary or obligatory, this time we chose, or the policymakers, stakeholders, they chose the voluntary way to go forward with the Nature Conservation Act. One crucial element of offsetting is, of course, transparency. And we all know that different compensation mechanisms and ecological offsetting has suffered from credibility challenges quite a lot recently. And sometimes we even talk about greenwashing, and this is something that we need to avoid. And here again, I think that in order to fight this greenwashing, the role of science is really crucial, and role of science in terms of delivering indicators that can be used is also very important. And in addition to this, let me also say that that setting strict requirements, we also want to ensure, firstly, that those requirements are met, and secondly, that anyone can really pursue the credibility of approved offsets. The first, of course, which is about the use of them should be achieved through certification by environmental authority, and the second, that anybody can be able to do so should be done through an open registry or of approved offsets. The system so needs to be reliable and credible, and it also needs to be simple and easy to use. I also heard there were discussion about no net loss and all those principles. One principle here is, of course, that is very important, is this do no significant harm principle as a statement, especially for how the green transition itself has been defined. I perhaps have to admit that Finland is not a front runner in the ecological offsetting, rather the opposite perhaps. However, I think that this has given us a possibility and advantage to actually learn from the best so far, and the recent submittal of the Nature Conservation Act to the Parliament is really a good step in my mind. But then again, I know that the world has changed quite rapidly recently, and not only during the last months, but also during the last couple of years. And we see a lot of interest in corporate environmental responsibility section here, and accelerated green transition is one of the words that we've been using quite much recently. And as perhaps more a personal note, but it's going to be very interesting to see how these things evolve besides what we do in the public sector, or how we do our legislative work. So the question was whether it should be voluntary or obligatory. Well, in our case, our decision makers, they chose the voluntary compensation mechanism in the new Nature Conservation Act. And I feel that the new Nature Conservation Act is a big step forward, and really big step also for all of us to set up the next goals, to put it this way. So now we have the criteria and legislation articles designed, and hopefully we get them out from the Parliament soon. And this is, of course, a very good base for the future work. Let me also use this opportunity to thank the organizers for this possibility to give my statement. And I also would like to especially thank Janne, Kotiaho and Atte Moilanen for their help in the preparation of the new Nature Conservation Act, as well as all of you. I know that most of you have been somehow involved in the work. But let me underline one thing more before I stop here, and this is the role of science. I think that especially here, the role of science is very important, and I would like to encourage all of you to keep up the good work and keep doing the scientific background that we all need for the legislation, for example, work. Thank you very much for the possibility.
Thank you, Juhani Damski. And I have one brief follow-up question for you, because this was just a topic that came up in the conversation here when we're talking about an open registry for biodiversity offsets, which was very strongly supported here on stage, and the issue of price transparency came up. So what I gathered here is that from the landowner's point of view, from a business's point of view, having price transparency would help the market function. Do you see that could become a part of the offset registry in some point in the future, and when?
Yes, I think first of all we have to move on in order to find all these matters, as was explained here very nicely. I think that we need to be, as being said, the simplicity of the system is something that we need to achieve, but also we need to learn as we go on. And this is very important that especially we talk to each other all the time and take part of the progress itself. We will see how it will end up, but I think that again I remain on this legislative level by just saying that I think that after we get it out from the Parliament, we have a playing field ready for us, and we really start to find out whether that sort of question is how important it finally will be, and how to get forward with that. We need to develop the system together. That's my point, basically.
Okay, thank you very much, Juhani Damski. And now I'm going to kind of direct this question to our entire panel. What do you think that are the strengths and weaknesses of voluntary offsetting, which is what we're talking about now at the current state in Finnish legislation?
Shall I start?
Go ahead, please.
Our opinion has been quite clear all the time. First, we need to decide if our market taking care of this, and also we need to do the piloting. What kind of model is suitable in Finland, and after that we are ready to decide what kind of, is it mandatory or voluntary mechanism. For us, it has been quite clear that that there is no idea to have voluntary mechanisms on the Nature Conservation Act, because markets are, it's something what market players are dealing with. So if I need to choose, it's mandatory. It should be mandatory, because there we need some legislation and so hard to understand why we start from voluntary. But the main thing is that first piloting, doing the preparation work, and then decisions. I need to comment these pricing mechanisms. I wouldn't put directly these prices to this register. For example, in forestry, forest owners, they are making in English the harvesting announcement to forestry center when they are doing something. And then the statistics, prices, and so they are collected by market players and published by Luke, for example. So I think that we need to discuss what is the wisest way.
Janne.
Yeah, when talking about the kind of advantages of voluntary compensation in practice, without going into the current nature protection law, I think the key advantage is, of course, that it enables us to move faster. It enables us to do individual projects with forward kind of looking companies who are forerunners in this field, and that enables us to collect the information of their kind of successes and also on their failures, and then learn from that in terms of developing the market as a whole. But I think that's the end of the benefits in terms of voluntary compensation. Then when we actually come to the structure of our system, of course, at the end, the only end goal should be that it's mandatory and it's part of the legislation as it should be. So voluntary can help us move faster, but then when we want to have everyone on board, then it has to be part of the legislation or legislation as a whole.
Did you have a question, a comment? Ilona?
Well, yes, I can put the legislative hat in my head now and comment from that point of view. First of all the puzzle pieces are needed and all the legislation has to kind of fit in together. But one part of the good practices in legislation is to see how it works about 3 years, then make an assessment, and then make the needed corrections or whatever is needed. And I think the current situation and also the public discussion is usually that this is not enough or this was too much. But from our point of view, we need some time to get the feedback, how it works to do the proper assessment and then do the kind of refitting or whatever needs to be done.
I have a question for the audience. I understand that you all should have red and green sheets of paper, because this is a vote. So assuming that biodiversity offsetting will be a part of the sustainability transition toolbox in the near future, what do you think? Would you prefer it to be voluntary or mandatory? So vote green, hold up a green paper for voluntary, red paper for mandatory. But I did also want to add a third option, which is that if you don't believe in biodiversity offsets being an important or like a necessary part of the toolbox at all, then simply raise your hand, no paper. So green, voluntary, red, mandatory, no paper, no offsetting. Okay, and we have Sanna documenting the results. Very good. So we, so basically, so now we have data. So that was quite a vast majority for red mandatory, but we also saw green papers, and I did not see any no offsetting hands. But there was one. There was also a vote for no. So thank you for that. Now, Professor Ollikainen, I wanted to hear, this is a field that you know very well, so I'd like to hear, what do we need to know about the state of voluntary offsetting right now? What scale can be reached with voluntary offset? Or basically, where are we right now with voluntary offsets?
If I make a comparison between the mandatory programs that we have in the world and the voluntary programs that we have in the world, the difference can be given in this way. For mandatory programs, we have quite strict rules. For mandatory programs, we have much higher demand for offsets than in the voluntary. In voluntary markets, we have vague rules that can be kind of modified by the traders. And when it comes to the turnover, in mandatory programs, the turnover is 3 times higher than in those voluntary markets, meaning that the price system that we have for companies to guide their choices and landowners to guide their restoration efforts is much kind of larger, and it gives much more kind of instructions and incentives. It kind of empowers more the actors than in the voluntary markets. In voluntary markets, we also have always reputation risk, because if the trading rules, somebody sort of uses loose trading rules, that can be accused then for the others who have done it well. So in that sense, to my mind, all papers, and actually I heard a large presentation in OECD on this matter, all they point out that at least from the economic point of view, mandatory market performs much better.
Thank you. Now, the introduction of mandatory offsets would require support from various kinds of stakeholders, and we've heard it's been mentioned many times that it needs to be made simple, it needs to be made approachable. We cannot assume that all sizes of companies, all kinds of companies will have someone interpreting the rules. That needs to somehow be supported by different kinds of actors. So what do you see as your organization's role in navigating this situation, and why is that? And shall we do again, like just starting from Markku, we'll just run through the panel.
Nice to be sitting with you, next to you. Actually, I told my organization's position. We want to have the piloting, we want to have the proof, and then we want to have the decisions. We are seeing that there are possibilities for our members, for forest owners, through both mandatory and through voluntary. And when we are talking about compensation or offsetting, we of course need to draw a line to somewhere. And when we talk about this, mostly we talk about land use change, not about, for example, forestry. Forestry, for example, is not causing forest loss, because we are always replanting and so on. So we see there are possibilities, but we don't know enough yet. We need the science. We have the great experts through panels, but we also need to have more forestry experts, forest science, forest management science, when we talk about the offsetting and building the right tools. And luckily we are also discussing that perhaps there is a new scientific panel in future which is more discussing about forestry as a whole. That's extra what you are doing excellent work.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I'll steal a few seconds, we had a poll, or actually a Gallup, to our members in early summer. We asked how they feel about biodiversity, how they see biodiversity in their own companies, and 83% of the respondents, they said that the importance of biodiversity will be increasing in the future. 55% of the respondents already said that it's very important or somewhat important in their current business operations. But then when we go down to the details, how many of them had set any specific targets related to biodiversity? 43%, and how many actually measured if they had achieved those targets? Only 13%. So that's how it goes currently within our member companies. They see it's a very important topic. They want to engage, they want to do the right thing, but they don't yet know how to actually and deliver on that. But when they were asked about why they're interested in biodiversity, what are the key stakeholders that they want to please with engaging on this topic, customers was number one. Customer is king in this regard as well. So the customer demand for responsibility also in terms of the nature as a whole is becoming more and more prevalent. So I'm cautiously optimistic that market behavior will drive us towards companies looking for solutions to also be or take biodiversity more into account. And that's where we will be needing a robust framework for biodiversity offsets. It will be also only one part of the toolbox, of course, but we need to have the robust framework for companies to utilize that. And of course, in terms of us as representatives of companies here in Finland, what we are going to do is to keep up the discussion on how do we fast track and make the robust framework available for companies as soon as possible. And in that regard, we want to have the kind of the standards and the frame as presented by Atte in the beginning, to be utilized in Finland as part of our structure. That's number one priority, and then of course we have to educate and help our companies to take advantage of the tools already available.
Was that the first time you asked your members that question?
Yes.
So then, of course, like this is just wild speculation, but one thing that I'm really interested in here is also kind of the temporal aspect, that speculating that if you had asked your members or the Finnish industries this 10 or 20 years ago, I imagine that the answers would have also been quite different.
Yeah, that's what I would think. Kind of biodiversity has taken the corporate field by a storm over the past, say, 24 months, and it's going to be that way. So it's not going to fade down from the agenda. It's going up only. So that's what we're currently seeing, and my finger is of course on the pulse of Finnish companies, but they operate in the global markets, and we see the same trend in those markets as well.
Okay, very brief comment from Markku.
We have also been asking our members, forest owners, what they think about biodiversity. It changed very much about 15 years ago. Before that, the forest conservation was based on legislation, and there was no voluntariness. But after the Metsä program came to Finland, after that, forest owners they have guts to be proud what kind of nature values they have in their forest. So it's daily life, and it's thanks to this new kind of tools and voluntariness.
That's a very good data point. Ilona, what is your ministry's role in helping everyone navigate this field?
Well, as I can go back where I started. Our role is threefold. And of course, continuing to finance the innovation is one of the biggest ones. Working with green financing is something we need to do, and steer also that financing towards market failures, and share the risk of investments that need to take place. But a third one is, well, I go back to the beginning of this current governmental program and implementation of that. We built together as a public-private partnership the carbon neutrality roadmaps with all the industries in Finland, and I think that time was right for that, and it was quite a success since it builds also a visibility into the investment roadmaps that we need to make in Finland, and that has steered quite a lot our RRF financing, the kind of implementing the European resilience roadmap as a whole. So from my point of view, I think from the industry policy point of view, my question would be that should we be building together as a PPP model the biodiversity roadmaps with different industries and see where that leads us to take the step further into real planning, what this means for different industries.
Okay, we're coming close to the end of this panel. I had one more question, and then I hope to end with remarks from Markku and Janne. And this is kind of a new topic that we haven't touched before in this panel, but mandatory ecological damage fees, or luontohaittamaksu in Finnish, that's sometimes also presented as an alternative for mandatory offsetting. And I'm sorry I have to ask for fairly brief answers here, but what do you think about mandatory fees? Would they be a good option or even a better option compared to mandatory ecological compensation? And if you have already in mind a way that that a mandatory fee, money collected from these fees should be used, should it be earmarked for something, then please elaborate on that as well. And now we can come from the other direction so that Markku doesn't have to go first every time.
Maybe I start briefly revisiting what we were just talking, and I think that there's two things that we didn't yet say, is that, well, Markku almost said that mandatory markets drive, or mandatoriness will drive the market. So that's why there is more demand also for the landowners when we make it, if we make it mandatory. And also what it does is that then it is an incentive to actually avoid the damage. So we actually get the first steps of the mitigation hierarchy on the table better. I think that I made my kind of position clear earlier about this obligatory versus mandatory, but I was wanting to touch upon what Juhani Damski said, because he said that we chose the voluntary. There was an element in the Conservation Act developed that was mandatory, but it was very narrowly built into the law. It was built on those situations where we allow damage of the already protected areas. And that was removed from the legislation in the political negotiations. It may be that it was actually fortunate that it was taken out, because it was so narrow. Now we have the rules of the game going into the legislation, but we don't take kind of stand on whether it's obligatory or voluntary. It's left open. So the mandatoriness is actually staying on the table because it was not put in a very narrow place in the legislation. And that leaves a bigger window or even a door open for future to maybe start building on that we start putting the mandatory business in the legislation as well. Then maybe one thing about the investors thing. There is this thing called carbon risk that investors and banks are already using when they are making their decisions to give loan or invest in something. And there are investment banks and other kinds of banks already toying with the idea that there should be a similar thing called nature risk. And I know that they are already building the tools to do that. So it is coming. It will definitely be there as well. Land use change versus ecological damage fee, because Markku said earlier about this land use change. I would say that mandatory offsetting would be a good tool. If we can't make it, then we need such fees for those who damage the environment. I would not maybe take the land use change, because there we have this man-made categorization of what we categorize as land use change. If we talk about ecological damage fee, then whatever damage you do, you pay a fee. In the land use change, you have to first categorize, okay, what counts as change? Like Markku said, when we cut the forest, we don't lose the forest because it grows back, but the ecology is damaged. So there should be a fee even in those circumstances.
Okay, I don't see the ecological damage fee as an instrument that should replace ecological compensations. There's nothing in the fee that guarantees that we can achieve this net positive impact. You can just compare this to, for instance, emissions trading versus emission tax. Emissions trading put a cap on emissions, while the tax does not do it unless it's by accident be set at the right level and there is no economic growth, there is no inflation and some other things. So to me, ecological compensation is a mandatory thing and absolutely necessary part of our biodiversity conservation tools. If we need to use in some other areas, then kind of ecological damage fee, we can think of that, but it will not replace, in my thinking, ecological compensation.
Okay, and then Ilona, Lundström, your views.
There's more money in the world right now than ever. And I think there will be players who are able to finance all the fees. And I think that is something that we should also take into account. The bad guys are going to do it anyhow.
In very short, I'm following on the lines of Markku's thinking. It's inevitable that we need to have a price on the damage on nature, or the land use change fee, or ecological damage fee, or whatever to call it actually. But then we need to find the tools that are the most cost efficient and give us the most bang for the buck, so to speak. That we are, despite that Ilona said that there's more money than ever, we are still in the world of limited resources, so we should utilize them right. And I would be quite cautious to go into favoring in one specific policy measure without actually knowing the current impacts. But that's not the typical lobbyist argument that, okay, we don't know everything, so we shouldn't do nothing. I fully support that we should move ahead, but we should really understand the impacts better and try to find the best tools.
Markku.
Yes, thank you. Forest owners are doing more and more every day. They are providing more mezzo forests than the government has money to buy. They are doing more and more forest nature management things through certification, for example. And if we have also this voluntary market-based for ecological compensation model, then I think that we are achieving a lot. Quite a many, if not all, indicators providing evidence how the biodiversity is developing. They are going to the right direction. Is it enough yet? No, not yet, but we are doing more. What we are worried about is that we are also losing forest, not only in Finland but also in other countries, and it's not because of forestry. It's because of infrastructure. It's because of construction and so on. And that's the reason why in our climate program we proposed this kind of land use change fee. It was a surprise to quite many that we are proposing this. It was because of climate. If this new land use would it would be, for example, a parking lot. No climate benefits in the future. Not at all. Then the fee should be higher. But if there are some climate benefits through carbon binding, for example, to fields, then the fee should be lower. So yes to fee.
Thank you. And I would like to thank all of our panelists for your contributions to this discussion. We have come to the end of this panel and to the time of the lunch break. So we will move on to lunch. The program will continue at 2 p.m. here with the keynote session, which is called Europe's Global Responsibility in Combating Climate Change. And that's also when the stream will continue. So again, thank you for the audience and thank you all of our fantastic panelists.